I'll just do some quick acknowledgements of the chat before we go ahead and get started. Salute to you, Steve, Citizens Climate Lobby, Clyde Anderson, Northeast Sierra Club, Omaha, Nebraska. Bruce from AFSCME, shout out to you. Tom White, Climate Rail Alliance, shout out to you all. Shout out to Fritz from RWU, shout out to you. Sarah Greenwald, 350 Bay Area. Robert G. Falkman in Midland, Texas, shout out to you. Dr. Predator B, shout out to you. Mike Shane, Moratorium Now Coalition in Detroit, shout out to you. Andrew Weir, RW co-chair, and Teamsters Canada Rail Conference, shout out to you. Adam Barrington, Cleveland, Ohio, shout out to you. Diane Whitner, Baltimore, Maryland, I just saw you earlier, shout out to you. Don Smith with Code Pink, shout out to you. Good friend Emmett Hopkins, just ran into you not too long ago, shout out to you in the Bay Area. Scott Marshall, Chicago, USW, shout out to you. We got Ann from Sierra Club and Nevada and Rail Coalition, shout out to you. Our good friend Danny Pearlstein from Riders Alliance in New York, shout out to you. And thank you to everyone hopping in the chat. We have a really, really, really wonderful panel for you tonight, and I cannot wait to bring you just this breadth of information from all of our panelists today. So thank you to all. Shout out to Veronica, lovely with LNS. Gary Pizan from Solutionary Rail, shout out to you. Lloyd McKernan from Sierra Club Springfield, Illinois, shout out to you. Wonderful. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our second webinar in our public transformation series titled Right of Way, What's Wrong with Passenger Rail. My name is Bakari Height, Transit Equity Organizer with Labor Network for Sustainability, and I wanted to kind of ground something with us. So we did the first webinar on freight rail, and it was really wonderful. Huge thank you to everyone that showed up today. But I wanted to kind of bring this picture into perspective today. So a little bit about me. I'm from a small town called Jessup, Georgia, which you can see on the picture on your screen. This is actually our Amtrak depot. This replaced our depot from the Atlantic coastline of the early 1900s. And it currently serves as one of the 5 Amtrak stations in the state of Georgia. It's a lovely station. I've had many opportunities not only to take the train to and from, but I've also had the pleasure of greeting my great aunt who lived in Miami, who also took the train up to Jessup to visit us. Lovely station. As you can see, there's a lot of space around there. This is actually in our downtown. The unfortunate part of it is that there's only a pair of trains that meet the station daily. One coming in, going to Miami, and one going out, going to New York. This is sort of the situation with most places in America outside of the Northeast. And we really want to learn why and how we can make this better. We've seen all the other countries around the world have lovely intercity rail services all across the country. And we're really trying to get to the point of how we can do so here, which is the point of this webinar of public transformation. We wanting to look at how we can get back to and bring rail into the public forum. So we have a lovely panel today to explain this and explain the history behind it and how we can get there. But first, we want a little housekeeping. We want to give a huge shout out to all of our major supporters and acknowledge the incredible work of the Railroad Workers United, the United Electrical Workers, the Climate Rail Alliance, the Sierra Club Rail Advisory Committee, Solutionary Rail, and the Moving Forward Network. Huge thank you to all of you. Without any of this work, none of this would be possible. So huge shout out to you all. Please go follow them if you have the chance. And I also want to give a huge shout out again to Railroad Workers United. We've been talking with them since this spring to try to put all this together. So it's a huge thank you that they wanted us to help them put all this together and also share into their campaigns, which we'll get into later. I also want to introduce the panel. We have a lovely panel of guests, and they have, like I said, they have a breadth of information as far as what they're going to bring to you today. But first, I wanted to say, if you don't know about LNS, we are a labor climate movement. We're trying to build and bring labor and the climate movement together. So please follow us on all of our social medias. Please go to our website at www.ln4s.com. Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and follow us on Instagram. We're posting a lot of information, especially everything that we have going on, and we'd like you to follow along with us as we're on our way. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel where we're going to be posting this, as well as other lovely, amazing content for you all to bring along. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. We have a lovely panel, and we will start with Fred Naiden. Fred is a retired professor of ancient history and a Solidarity member of RWU and veteran motorman and transit worker, as well as a TWU member on the New York City subway system. He also has a subspecialty in the history of working people's struggles to control and obtain the public stake in transport and other work. He specifically is very knowledgeable in regarding the history and efforts to publicly own rail operations in North America. We also have Paul Lindsey, a former 17-year employee and locomotive engineer of Union Pacific, and he is also an embattled whistleblower being retaliated against for speaking out. He has been published multiple times in op-eds and has been speaking out on this issue in many forums. We also have Mr. Samuel Jordan, the president of the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition, to which he founded in 2016 to complete the Baltimore Red Line rail project and recover its transformative economic benefits for the Baltimore metropolitan region and the African American, Hispanic, low-income, and transit-dependent communities adversely affected by the cancellation of the project in 2015. And last but not least, we have Ron Kaminkow. Ron has worked in the rail industry for 27 years, since first hiring out in Chicago with Conrail. He has worked as a brakeman, conductor, and an engineer in freight service for both Conrail and Norfolk Southern. He currently works as a locomotive engineer for Amtrak and is based out of Reno, Nevada. He currently serves as organizer for the group Railroad Workers United. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us today. Now, I want to start with a little grounding in the history of this, because, with passenger rail, it's easy to get caught up in why it's not as good as Europe, why it's not as good as Asia. But to know that, you kind of got to know the history of it. So, Fred, you being a historian and a former railroad worker, what should we know about the broader history of passenger lines in the U.S.? You're on mute.
Excuse me. Are you now hearing me for the first time?
Yes.
Good. Let's start with this image. I'll be talking about New York because this is where I work. New York illustrates the peculiar features of the way public railroads, subways, trolleys, and commuter lines are run in this country. Almost all of them are subject to some entity called an authority with a capital A. Down in Atlanta, it's MARTA. In New York, it's the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Although New York being the mess it is, there's more than one authority. This is an odd situation. It isn't a true public control. It's a public something or other. But no, the public does not control these authorities. Those of you who've had to deal with a transportation authority in your metro area have learned this the hard way. Unions that want more safety, less filth, higher wages. How about the fare? They found these authorities to be mostly hostile entities. So our problem is that we have a public agency of a sort, but it's not truly public. it's privately controlled or bureaucratically controlled to a large degree, even though it is a public agency. And of course, the reason it's a public agency is that the city or the state, putting aside Amtrak with its special situation, owns the right of way without exception. Let's look at New York as an example of this. We're now going to go back, of course, to the beginning when there is no authority. Authorities are a 20th century, and by the way, a British invention. So in the beginning, if you look at Manhattan, just before the Civil War, you see the built-up area. Central Park is just off the map to the right. The built-up area goes a bit past 14th up into the 20s or 30s. Look a little closer, and I think you can make out the avenues going uptown. And if you look at these avenues, these bands running across your map, you'll see that some of them have a thick line in the middle, and some don't. These are the railroads. The railroads are all in the street, killing people and working horses to death and earning gazillions. And of course, going into debt, which is where much of the gazillions has to go. The city owned the right of way. The city should have been the master. And indeed, it gave grants to these railroad companies and laid down terms. For example, the fare, when the first railroad went into business, and that's the one, as you look at your map, by the way, that if you go to the bottom, which is the East River, though you can only see the two letters of river, go looking up row by row, and you'll see that second line going way up to the edge of the map and veering off to the right. That's the oldest urban railway in the United States and indeed in the entire world. It was told you would better charge 6 1/4 cents. That's 1/2 of a Spanish piece of 8, the only decent currency the United States had in this remote period. And just to show you that city governments can make mistakes, the railroad was told that all the ties must be made of granite. Wood wouldn't be firm enough. Well, you can imagine what the railroad did about that. They called up their buddies in Albany on the new telegraph system, and they got rid of that one. And they got extensions and so on and so forth. They began controlling the city and using the state government too in order to improve their prospects. They were competing furiously, buying each other out, debts were swelling. This then is the original railroad system. It's a health horror. And the worst of it, of course, isn't even the disease that it's spreading, but those steam engines going up and down these streets, killing children almost every day. I went through the papers to see whether it was several times a week at least, and yes, it was. They got away with it. The city fought back, but not hard enough. Let's now go to image number 2, the second one that I asked you to put up. Can you do that, Bakari? Thank you. Something amiss? I don't see it yet. 1890, there it is, number 2, right. What we'll be seeing when it comes up is the next stage. And what I want to point out to you about this stage is that we again have a network of railroad lines, and it's going straight up Manhattan, and it's going up the avenues that you'll remember from some of your subway rides, but it's in the air. It's elevated. What does this mean? This is a step forward for the railroad companies because a railroad in the air is something they own entirely. They don't own the right of way. It's the city's air up there, but they own everything else. And they're competing furiously, and building a railroad like this in the air is obscenely expensive. So we have the problem of furious competition and deepening debt, and the city is on the defensive. Because this, of course, is an even more dangerous kind of railroad than the previous. I mean, imagine what it's like being hit by a coal flying out of a steam engine that's 40 feet above you. That's going to hurt. That's going to hurt. when a large nail drops out. Never mind a spike. Ouch. These railroads are basic to the city's economy. They're ferociously unsafe. They're cheap. The thing that the city government is doing, the one way in which it tries to remain master, is to hold the fare down. It gives up on other matters like safety. Unions? The man who ran the elevated network that you're looking at on this map, going up into the Bronx, spinning up the east and west sides both, the man in charge of this beast was Jay Gould, the greatest union buster in American history, perhaps, the man who broke the terrific Southwestern strike in the United States, the man who said so famously or infamously, I can always hire one half of the working class to shoot the other half. And New York City is lending its policemen to this project. So the city is taking it, and the workers and the riders are taking it and taking it hard. And now, finally, we see a more ambitious notion of what public ownership means. The elevated is a mess. Put it underground. The subway was the alternative to this health hazard. It was put underground, and this time, the city built it. Before the privates had done the building, the city gave the grant. Now the city built it. The city built the subway. They hired a contractor, and the contractor turned around and said, we'll run it for you too. But the city built it. This was public property, and all the contractor got was a lease, the same as any other tenant. The city is now being a bit bolder, and when the subway is built, it is much safer, much faster, much cleaner, and it's organizable. And unions begin to make their way onto the railroad in New York City in the early 20th century. The city's increasingly bold role and the union's increasing power go together. And this, of course, is why one of the two parties in New York government, for the Republicans then are competitive in New York State, hates public ownership. The Republicans hate it and fear it. The Democrats in Tammany Hall nod, and the socialists are screaming for it. This is the political situation in which this happens. You have a 2.5-party system where somebody like Bernie Sanders is getting plenty of votes and influencing basic decisions about infrastructure. All right. But of course, this good news can't last. What happened? The private subway companies, there were two of them, one in Brooklyn and one in Manhattan. The one in Manhattan, by the way, is today's numbered trains, numbers 1 through 7. Well, these companies went broke. They were buying out their competitors, going into debt to do it. Mr. Subway bought out all the streetcars, went gazillions into debt. When he bought the streetcar company out, and he bought out the elevateds too, one of the executives of the companies he bought out hosted him at a dinner and gave him a beautifully decorated box as a gift. He opened up this gorgeous box. It was about, 3 feet long. It was the size of a railroad spike. And of course, what was contained in the box was a warning, not a gift. It was a rusty spike. This was the junk he was buying to get his monopoly. This was the debt load he was taking on. And what happens to him? The city buys him out in 1940 because he wants out. That's how fast the subway went from being a financial killing to a fatal killing for the owners of same. And the city went into debt. And now you understand the picture. The city goes into debt, and then what? The fare goes up. Maintenance goes down. The unions get worse contracts. And the riders? Well, when the city got the railroad, the riders finally were being listened to. And the fare was kept low. And the city government, now we're after World War II, was making some promises. But they're going broke. And now, when we've come to the end of the string, so to speak, and the privates are broke, and the city is broke, now the authority steps out of its British background and is established for the first time for a transit operation in America. The New York City Transit Authority is established in 1954. Port authorities already exist on the British model. This is the first transit version. And the notion is a transit authority doesn't issue stock, so it can't go broke. A transit authority has unlimited borrowing power. so it can always borrow more. It's being backed by the sovereignty of the state. And the transit authority isn't answerable to the riders, because if you look at these transit authority boards, they're dominated by appointees of governors, most of whose voters don't use these railroads. It's set up so that, in effect, a suburban voter who might take the Long Island Railroad has more voting power than a poor Black New Yorker who has to take the subway. It's tilted towards the state government, the suburbs, the exurbs, and of course, towards various political interests that can prevail on the governor to put them on the board. The outstanding example in New York was taking a representative of Con Ed, the big power company, which was already selling power to the city-run railroad after 1940. It wanted to sell more power. In other words, the contractor wanted to take the customer captive. And what the customer finally did was sell its own public power plants, which it had. The New York City subway system had its own power plants. It paid below market rates for energy. And those plants were sold because that's what Con Ed wanted. And the authority board nodded and did it. So that's how this scam works. You have a board that's not responsible to riders. It's chosen by governors. If a member is put on the board to represent riders, as is true in New York City today, that is one of the 2 board members who does not have a board vote. All the businessmen appointed have a vote. The bankers, they have votes, but the representative of the riders does not have a vote. And of course, there's one other representative on the board who is similarly humiliated. And yes, this was the best organizer Brooklyn buses ever had. TW sent him up to that board post, and he told me, I never did a lick of good work again because I can't vote. That's how this game is played. They're an authority when there's an authority. You aren't. And the bad news, brothers and sisters, there's only one major subway in the United States that isn't misgoverned in this way, the municipal subway in San Francisco. It's still run by the city, so that the voters and the riders have say. But all the rest are run by authorities on fundamentally the same plan. New York's distinction is it has more than one authority. New York overdoes it. More bureaucracy, more authority, less efficiency. And you're lucky if you live in Chicago. It's bad there, but it's not as bad. And with that note of envy for the Windy City, I conclude my talk. The moral of this story is, know what kind of agency is running your railroad. Know who appoints whom. Know who is answerable to whom. There's more to ownership than just ownership. There's control. There's power. The problem is not that the public doesn't own things. It doesn't control things. Power is the problem. Power is the problem. The public's not the problem. These powers behind the scene, these are the problem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. Paul, I wanted to go to you. When folks think of passenger rail in this country, they inevitably think of Amtrak. But where does Amtrak come from? Fred's kind of pointed it out as far as, with authorities for like localized and intra-city rail. But as far as intercity rail, where was the origins of Amtrak? And, how do these origins resound today for good rail service, right of way, and the corporate owners' sole focus on profits?
Yes, so Amtrak is a very, very misunderstood organization. It kind of goes back to the idea that at one time, in order as a privilege of operating a freight railroad in the United States, you were expected to provide passenger service. And there's this really misguided idea, especially from the Republicans, that Amtrak always needs to, that they're not showing a profit, that they're not profitable, that it needs to show a profit like every other free market transportation system, even though, like our municipal airports, they're not profitable. They're not profitable without subsidies. But so Amtrak, there's this misguided idea that Amtrak and passenger trains were profitable in the past, and that Amtrak is just some horrible government company that needs to be done away with. But that is inaccurate. So for the most part, there were profitable passenger trains, but for the most part, passenger trains throughout our history were only profitable because they hauled the U.S. the U.S. postal traffic, the mail. And at one time, they actually sorted the mail on passenger trains, and due to automated sorting and a lot of things, it did away with that. But at the same time, passenger trains were mail trains. The passenger business was actually more of a side business, and it was required by the government as a privilege operating a profitable freight railroad. And much of our history, the freight railroad system has been immensely profitable. And there have been monopolizations and massive fortunes won and lost in the freight rail industry, consolidation, to the point that we're at now, that we have 4 giant companies, essentially, plus the 2 Canadian lines, that control the rail infrastructure in the entire United States. And these companies feel the need. They don't feel that passenger rail deserves to be sharing their tracks, but they seem to forget that in 1971 they were not in this kind of financial state. The railroads in the United States, most of them, were in very, very poor financial state. And this has to do with a lot of reasons that we could have an entire webinar just discussing on its own. But during this time period, in the 60s and into the 70s, there were large bankruptcies in the industry. One of the largest, or probably the largest, being the Penn Central up in the Northeast, which was it was a failed merger attempt between the Pennsylvania and the New York Central that both have their own passenger trains. And there were other railroads such as the Milwaukee Road and the Rock Island, and all of these lines that used to all have passenger service that went bankrupt because of government subsidized highways, because of a regulatory structure that had not modernized. So one of the issues is that at one time the freight railroads didn't want to compete with each other like a private company. So as they usually do, and as what happens nowadays, and we see it today, when a company doesn't want to compete, they go to the government and pass regulations so they don't have to compete in the market. So the railroads in the late 19th century did the same thing by lobbying to establish the Interstate Commerce Commission, and it was sold to the public as a way to keep rates down, but actually rates went up during this time because they didn't have to compete. The government set rates high enough that the railroads always made a profit, right? But this worked for a long time, because in 1920, the railroads were the only game in town. You didn't have planes, you didn't have interstate highways, you didn't even have a proper U.S. highway system back then. So the railroads were the only game in town. But fast forward to the 60s and 70s, and now you have interstates and jets and everything else, and this public infrastructure that was publicly owned infrastructure. The interstates are not some bastion of free market capitalism. They are publicly owned infrastructure, and it outcompeted the rail system. So by 1971, the passenger system was on the verge of complete collapse in the United States, and Amtrak was created as a way for these companies that had been required by law as a privilege of running a freight railroad, provide these passenger trains, allowed them to legally give up their passenger service. They gave this new government-owned corporation their rail equipment. They paid into it, and they allowed these passenger trains to use their track under the understanding that they would let Amtrak use their rail and give them priority. That was the understanding. That is where Amtrak came from. So it was never meant to be profitable, because there's certain things that just will never be profitable. I challenge anyone from any party to explain to me how municipal airports are profitable without federal subsidies, or how the Soo Locks that run between Lake Superior and Lake Huron are profitable without the Army Corps of Engineers, or how the Interstate 10 is profitable, hauling trucks. I mean, yeah, they do collect revenue, but it's not enough to pay for it. Some forms of infrastructure are just, we understand their vital importance to society, and we know that they grow our economy and they're valuable and we need them. That has been lost with passenger rail. So we realized that we needed it. That's why we created Amtrak, but we have allowed it to gradually deteriorate and get worse and worse and worse as these freight railroads have now created and conjured this argument that the public now believes that Amtrak just is sucking off of, you know, the government, and that they are that they're somehow taking taxpayer money. They're antiquated. They don't need to be there anymore. And not only that, totally in the dark as to what the freight railroads are doing to Amtrak's operation, essentially sabotaging their on-time performance, especially running longer trains than we have sidings for Amtrak to get around them. And it really is a gross dereliction of duty by our representatives that they do not enforce this, and that the Surface Transportation Board and other regulatory boards don't come down harder on enforcing that Amtrak receive priority. One point, I don't want to take too long. The other point I want to make on this is that when Amtrak was created in 1971, it was because the railroads were going bankrupt, and it was essentially a bailout. It was because the freight railroads were going bankrupt. Well, they are not bankrupt anymore. In fact, they have been gushing with cash for several decades now, to the point that they feel the need to spend more on share buybacks every quarter than they do on capital expenditure on the railroad, on labor for all their conductors, engineers, switchmen, signalmen, locomotive mechanics, car mechanics, everything. They spend more on share buybacks, and that's finally starting to develop cracks in it. Even the financials, the financial news outlets are even starting to talk about that Union Pacific and these other companies. But the problem is that the damage is done. We have decades where they have put billions of dollars into their own pockets through share buybacks, and they did not put that into bridges. They did not put that into double track. They did not put that into coordinating with providing better passenger service or any sort of anything that would actually be worthwhile to passenger service in America, or even making the freight rail system sustainable for the future. And personally, I believe that's because they believe they're too big to fail, and they can just buy back their own shares, and eventually one day the government will just bail them out. And because of these buybacks, these railroads are running into precarious financial problems now, because Union Pacific wrecked their balance sheet by buying back shares using bonds, but they don't have the cash flow to repay those bonds when they mature. But now interest rates are a whole lot higher. So if they have to reissue new bonds to pay off the old bonds, where does your cash flow go? So I'll conclude that by basically saying that is what happened. That's where Amtrak came from, and the freight railroads are gushing with cash. They have been for all these years, and if we were going to do anything at all, we should have potentially put the obligation back on them again. But Amtrak was created to relieve these companies of an obligation that they had.
Thank you so much, Paul. I wanted to hop back with intracity rail for a minute and ask Samuel a question. You're president of the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition. Briefly tell us a little bit about your coalition and just kind of what the Red Line means to Baltimore, and just kind of what public ownership means in such the history that's happened with the cancellation and then now with this new opportunity.
I'd be glad to. For Transit Equity Coalition. Can you hear me well? I don't see that my tile is alight yet, Bakari. Oh, here we are. Okay. I think I want to make sure that there's a perspective that's introduced into the discussion. And by the way, if there are others on the call who are from Baltimore region, I'd appreciate it if you would put your email address in the chat. We can certainly connect, because we're engaged now in a campaign to determine what mode? Will it be bus rapid transit or light rail transit? That becomes the anchor for the Baltimore public transportation system, what's called now the Baltimore Link. Our history, I want to just sort of go through that quickly, but then get back to what I think is going to be perhaps a lot more germane to the general discussion. That is, with the Eisenhower Interstate Highway Program, that obviously did change dramatically the prospects for the nation's economy, helped to build the economy. Well, we're looking now, and our coalition is hoping that the work that we're doing at the local level can translate to a national support for what we call railization of the nation's economic growth. That is, there should be a lot more rail, a lot more regional passenger rail, but a lot more local systems anchored by rail. And that's where we sort of come in. The Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition was founded within 2 hours of Governor Larry Hogan's cancellation of the Red Line Light Rail project. What we saw in his action was a reminder that public transportation is a control legacy from the period of enslavement, wherever, or put it another way, public transportation is racially conflicted wherever people of color live in this nation. And there's no exception. When we speak of rail systems at the regional and state level and national level and so on, sometimes we're overlooking the fact that at the very base of the economy, in most of the cities in which you live, there are 53 now on the call, and that might mean there are 53 localities, perhaps, that when viewed closely, you'll see that they're absolutely 2 separate transit systems. One for people of color, modest income households, and those who are what we call transit reliant. And what we're trying to do is not only complete the Red Line Light Rail project that was canceled by Larry Hogan, in 2015, but to establish it in the local discussion, in the general discourse, that the best way for Baltimore to achieve its potential as a ranking city in this nation is by first tending to the matter of a modern, multimodal, reliable public transit system that greatly improves transit equity, but also takes advantage of the transit-oriented development that's attracted by fixed guideway systems. As you would all know, the mantra in the industry is that development follows rail. Buses follow development. It's true here, and it's true what we've seen and what you've seen all over the country, whether it's Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, even Los Angeles in 2016 with Measure M, practically renounced its autocentric past by adopting the largest single measure that will generate about $130 billion over the next 40 years to plan, redesign, and anchor its system, public transit system, on rail. Of course, it's multimodal with buses. We're multimodal as well. Each mode has its own niche. Each mode has its own benefits. But in Baltimore, what we're looking for in the completion of the Red Line Light Rail project, not only the improvement in transit equity, that is, not only access to transit, but destination access, getting where you want to go and need to go. But there's also the planning in the Red Line, 13 years, 2002, 2015, we planned for at least $3 to $6.5 billion in transit-oriented development to be attracted along that Red Line corridor, which is 14.2 mile crossing from east to west of Baltimore, from Bayview in the east to CMS Woodlawn in the west. Those of you who know the city know that that goes east-west through the heart of the city, near the harbor, but also through some of the wealthiest as well as some of the poorest communities in Baltimore. But it was because of the fact that it would also benefit people of color. It was the subject in Larry Hogan's campaign that Black folks in West Baltimore will hop on the light rail to get over into East Baltimore and steal white folks' television sets. I don't know why it's always TV sets, but it is also a myth about Black crime on public transportation. Studies show that you're safer in public transportation than you are in a grocery store. With respect to COVID, there's also the myth of Black disease on public transportation. Yet, even in New York, there's Fred is here from New York. No studies have shown that more than 4 to 5% of COVID infections were even remotely associated with mass transit. If you want to get COVID, stay home. 30% of it is right there. So we're battling all these myths, but the point we're trying to make is that when we have cities, localities like yours, looking first at what's happening at the base of the economy, can your essential workers get to work? In Baltimore, they can't. We have one of the most unreliable systems in the nation, but we're also the only system in the nation that not only has no authority governing its transportation system, but it's governed directly from the governor's office to his own Department of Transportation, and there's no participation by anyone else. It's what we call a commander system. So Fred, when you're speaking about people not being able to participate, not only are they not participate, they're ignored here in Baltimore, here in Maryland. So we're approaching this issue in several ways. One is build the red line, but along the way, we know that we are building informed but resolute regional constituency that will demand the completion of the Red Line Light Rail project as a light rail transit project to give us most of the bang that can be offered, and by fixed guideway systems like light rail, for example. So I would sort of emphasize that one, in order to get the realization of the nation, we need to consider realization of these local systems. That is, there is no major city in the nation that has its public transportation system anchored by a bus. Baltimore does. When people come from New York, Fred, to Baltimore, it's like jumping back into the 1950s with respect to public transportation. In fact, when we challenged MTA just on a matter of reliability, they changed the definition of on-time performance to 2 minutes early, 7 minutes late. But what that does is make it even harder, more difficult for the essential workers, those who don't own cars, but would use public transit were reliable, made it more difficult for them to maintain steady work. In fact, if a person is without a car, access to a car here in Baltimore, but use public transit to get to work, they are experiencing what we call precarious employment. That kind of work dependent upon public transit without access to cars means you're entering a workforce that's facing all the time high turnover and low wages. That's one of the costs of unreliable public transit when we don't have it anchored by a reliable fixed guideway system. I would mention, Bakari, while speaking of it this way, that one, it's clear to us in our experience with other cities around the country, racism is the chief suppressor of investments in public transportation. What we've also found is that there is no robust enforcement of Title VI in the nation. In fact, the deal that Lyndon Johnson, the greatest arm twister in the history of the Congress, made with the states in approving and passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, left the states as self-policers. Maryland, as a result of the work of our coalition and our friends, have gotten Governor Moore to sign what we call the Transportation Equity Act of 2023. What it does is require prior transit equity analyses before major service changes or policy decisions can be implemented. That is, what impact will there be on the communities most directly affected? We want that kind of analysis to be featured in the work of transit advocates all across the country. I would sort of indicate, Bakari, that out of our movement, with this discussion, transit equity systems, our friends from around the country, if we can introduce into the local matrix, the local discussion about transit, and see what improvements must be made there with respect to transit equity, that is the basis that can change the perspective that we have on rail transit. The autocentric culture has done its damage. It's ruined the economy, now it's ruining the environment, or you can put it any way you want it. But the point we're getting at is that we must address the intersectionalities of public transportation, along with improving public transportation. And those intersectionalities include, of course, the most important response to climate change is mass transit. Get people out of cars. Don't talk about getting people out of cars. Get people out of cars with a system that's reliable that they would use were it available. Housing, health. We co-authored a study with Johns Hopkins Hospital, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, that identified communities in the region and in the city, we want to take it statewide, that were in need of major investments in pollution reduction and in the health impacts, adverse health impacts as a consequence of pollution. In other words, particularly pollutants generated by the transportation sector, which, as you know, generates at least 40% of the harmful pollutants in the nation. Well, we have to start there, and we have to make sure that we're not halting this improvement with just a new bus. In fact, those who aren't really particular about who rides and who's served and don't care if they get to work, they always just simply, and our approach to it is, throw a bus at it and don't spend a penny more. Well, that is exactly what we think is making the difference in the way the nation it looks at public transportation. The nation itself should be looking at the economy and the growth of economies when they're stimulated by rail transit at the local, regional, and state level. I want to stop there, Bakari. I'm sure there's some questions, and I haven't gone through the last hour and 45 minutes of my remarks. So I will stop there and perhaps see how that can be added to our discussion over the long term.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Really quickly, Ron, you've been on both sides of this, and then like also with you coming from the completely different part of the country, what do you see that's missing, or what do you see as kind of what's broken that's preventing passenger rail?
Well, I'm convinced that the biggest bulwark today that prevents us from having a robust passenger rail system is private ownership of the infrastructure of this country. We still have the biggest infrastructure, despite the fact that about half of it has been abandoned. We have 140,000 miles of track in this country. We still could front an amazing passenger rail network, but we don't. And what we saw happen after the Second World War is most rail systems in the world, if they had not already been nationalized, they were at that point, including the UK, France, most of Europe, and so forth. And then through the 50s and 60s, especially in places like Japan, we saw the first high-speed rail bullet train in 1964. There's never been a fatality. It's carried X number of billions of people. People say to me all the time, I just got back from Europe and the trains are incredible. I remember maybe 10 years ago, Spain announced that they were going to spend an astronomical figure linking all of the major urban centers of the country with high or higher speed rail. And I did the math and figured out that basically this was an astronomical amount. It would be something like the equivalent of the United States investing $50 billion a year in rail passenger service for the next 10 years proportionately. But we don't do it. And it's a huge problem when you don't own the infrastructure. The rail industry doesn't want to play ball. Having worked for Conrail, which was taken over in a big corporate merger in '99 by Norfolk Southern, I had a lot of experience and I delayed a lot of passenger trains. And now I get delayed by freight trains in front of me. And I've been a member of the Rail Passengers Association for years, and Railroad Workers United is a dues-paying member of both RPA and the Rail Users Network. And I watch year after year, decade after decade, as these well-intended passenger train advocates beat their head against the wall. And we always come back to the question of, we don't own it. We're at the Class 1 railroad's mercy. And therefore, we don't get expanded frequency. We don't get new routes. We don't get on-time performance. We get massively delayed trains, and it simply hampers the ability to grow and expand the network. And so many of us who work for the railroad, and in particular in RWU, have come to the conclusion we don't want to fight this fight any longer with one hand or both hands tied behind our backs. It's sad to look at the Amtrak map from the 80s or 90s, and it shrunk dramatically. If all of the routes that had actually been taken off since Amtrak came into being in 1971 still existed, we would have a fairly decent national network of passenger trains. But Amtrak is on its knees. And I think a good example of the freight industry's sabotage is in Mobile, Alabama, where there used to be a train from New Orleans to Jacksonville. The route was washed out by Hurricane Katrina. When CSX, the host railroad, rebuilt it, they said no thank you to the Sunset Limited train, which Amtrak's trying to restore since that time. Norfolk Southern and CSX put up a huge fight this past year to keep two little trains, 4 cars long, from going between Mobile and New Orleans, stating that it would completely block up their railroad. And this is nonsense. The only reason that railroad, which only is running less than 10 trains a day, would have a problem handling 2 little tiny passenger trains is because they are running 3 and 4 mile long trains. And that is no way to run a railroad efficiently. It's completely incompatible with scheduled operations, and particularly incompatible with passenger train operations. So I could write a book about why the private rail industry is passively and actively sabotaging passenger rail. But if we don't take on that question, I think it's going to be a huge uphill battle. Ironically, Amtrak's got the biggest grant it's ever gotten in its 50-year history to move forward with new routes, new corridors, new frequencies, et cetera, et cetera. But the Class 1s, I can guarantee you right now, are saying over our dead bodies, there's no way that we want to see more cumbersome passenger trains on our railroads, because they would have to adopt an operating model that actually is efficient, and they're not interested in efficiency. They're not interested in moving freight or passengers. We are actually moving 21% less freight than we were 16 years ago. So the rail industry, as it's currently owned and constructed, simply is not up to the task, and therefore Railroad Workers United believes must come under public control.
Thank you so much, Ron. Paul, you had a comment?
Yes, I wanted to echo exactly what Ron was saying about the train to Mobile and give another example of that, and that would be the city pairs of Los Angeles and Las Vegas. You would think that if any 2 cities in the United States would be ideal for multiple trains a day, passenger rail, it would be that particular city pair. They are the right distance. They have the right market to warrant such to have a passenger train that went through there until 1996. It was called the Desert Wind. So because of this, if you look at the early 2000s, Amtrak tried to actually restore service between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, and that line happens to be Union Pacific. And they even built Talgo tilt equipment so the train could go faster around corners. It was going to happen. They were sure it was going to happen. but Union Pacific used their bully pulpit position to tell Amtrak, absolutely not, you will not, unless you pay for double track on our steep grade portion, which is a place called Sema Hill, runs, in between Barstow and Las Vegas. There's a very steep grade, Sema Hill, and they told Amtrak that this needed to be double tracked if Amtrak wanted to come back and use that. And the entire project fell apart because this section of track happens to lie in the Mojave National Preserve, and somewhere someone used their pull and shut it down. And I believe wholeheartedly that it was Union Pacific, and they tried to pull the whole, oh, it's in the Mojave National Preserve, and they didn't get the permits to do it. But every time they want to expand Interstate 15, they go right ahead and expand that to their heart's content. That is a very similar situation to what Ron said about the Sunset Limited in Mobile, Alabama. That is an example of a Class 1 using their position to prevent passenger rail, and that's another reason why that rail line should be ultimately publicly owned.
Absolutely. And you mentioned city pairs, and I think the Bright Line from Vegas to Rancho Cucamonga is a great example of that. And now the Bright Line also opening from Miami to Orlando. I think these city pairs will really make good examples of that. But I wanted to kick a question to all of the panelists. How do we tie a passenger rail system in the public interest to climate protection? I'm sure all of you have seen the wild weather we've had this year, and also, with the ties to electrification with wanting to electrify rail in places like Maryland and places like Massachusetts and Chicago. How do we do that? And would it be enough to make a case of that?
Who wants to go first?
I would love to. What Railroad Workers United has been doing the last 10 years or so is reaching out every way we can to build alliances with environmental organizations. You've heard it said, labor and environment, you can't have both. Well, that's absolute nonsense. As far as I'm concerned, the labor movement and the environmental movement are essential to each other. And I do believe that environmental organizations are coming around to a deeper understanding of labor issues. And I think unions are also coming around to understand, if we look at the recent auto workers strike, and the understanding of building a just transition and moving away from fossil fuels. On the railroad, we've traditionally hauled a lot of coal, a lot of oil, fossil fuels, and need to move away from that. We have great capacity for moving all sorts of freight and passengers. And so to get these two great blocks of society, working people and their unions, environmentalists, activists, and organizations like the Sierra Club and others, to come together around this understanding that transportation is now the biggest source of fossil fuel emissions. Trains can actually, first off, are way more efficient than any other form of transportation, way more environmentally sensitive, and much, much safer. And you can move as much freight and passengers down a double track railroad as you can the 6-lane interstate highway on about 10% of the real estate. The advantages are endless. You can electrify rail and generate that electricity with wind, solar, geothermal, and other renewables. And so literally provide a carbon neutral transportation network. How does this translate into what workers want? Well, on the railroad, we've seen a diminishment of 2 million jobs down to about 200,000. We should have 2 million jobs in rail right now. And the future would be double and triple tracking, electrification, higher speed, more freight, more passenger, in the interest of rural communities, revitalization throughout the country, in the interest of the riding, traveling public, in the interest of industry, the economy as a whole. I really do feel that rail can play a huge central role in bringing the nation together, revitalizing the economy as a whole, to say nothing of depressed areas, both urban and rural. My partner, she chides me of thinking that the railroad is the solution to everything. And I tell her the reason I believe that is because it's true. Rail is essential, and I see the private ownership of rail literally constricting and restraining us from making this grand development. So ideally, with the labor movement and environmental movement coming together around these basic understandings of the efficiencies of rail, we can move this forward politically.
You know,
Absolutely.
McCurry, I would add to Ron's comments. I think he's sort of saying the same things we were saying earlier, that one, realization of the nation's economic potential is what we're speaking about. That is, the entire nation needs to think through the difference between an expense and an investment in the future. We always make sure that everyone knows that a transit advocacy organization is also an environmental protection movement. That is, you're getting folks out of cars. You're reducing the congestion and pollution loads that widening highways always brings. Now, you know, people will say, well, maybe it doesn't lead to congestion automatically, but look at it over the long term. What should we be doing? Look at the governor's budget and see where his priorities are. When you look at Maryland's governor's budget under Hogan, 70% of the entire budget went to roads and highways, the State Highway Administration. Only 2% went to transit. We demanded, what about just 4% going to transit? It won't hurt roads and highways if they're only getting 68% of the budget. Okay, but when you look at it more carefully, you see that that 68% was not doing a great deal of service to the people of the state. It was simply widening highways. It was extending the vicissitudes, if we can use that word, of the autocentric culture. And it's leaving people out who would use transit were it available, were it reliable. In fact, what we're suggesting is that, one, we should even solarize the Red Line Light Rail project. Every year, right now, renewable energy produces cheaper electricity than conventional methods of producing electricity. And it will be progressively inexpensive with each passing year. So solarizing the Red Line Light Rail project is a gift that will keep on giving. That's true across the board when we use renewables. And we can have a renewable, and we can have a green economy that would go along with it. We have to take a look at the damage done to the society, dividing it on racial lines as well, by the autocentric culture. It has run its course. It is now time for us to see the United States with a different profile for generating economic development and for bringing communities together rather than dividing them. Rail can do that.
Thank you. Paul, go for it.
You're muted, Paul.
Yeah, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry. So I think that one way that rail can be displayed to the public in a way that they would understand how it affects the environmental movement, and a way to improve our climate for the future, is we need to change the narrative on cars and the electric car on top of that. So it is vastly easier to electrify our rail system than it is to, like we're trying to do, put in millions of electric charging stations, which will eventually happen, but it's far easier to do it with rail right now. And bottom line is that the electric vehicle, the electric car, is still a band-aid on the fact that the car is the problem. It doesn't matter whether it is powered by gas or powered by electric. You're still going to have traffic jams. You're still going to have urban heat islands that are created by roads and asphalts and parking lots, which make climate change worse. You're still going to have the traffic jams and the problems with the commute and the miserable non-places that are just littered with cars that don't have any places to enjoy your community and walk and bike and engage with your neighbors. When there's just cars, most of the noise coming off of cars is actually tires, not the engines. So as far as where rail ties into this, the public narrative needs, it's almost like the public does not even know, they don't even think about rail electrification, and that needs to be pushed and pushed hard as the thing that needs to be done right now, because we haven't even come up with a standard to where all the electric vehicles use the same charging ports. We're still fighting like Tesla and Thomas Edison did with the AC/DC standard. We're doing that with electric car charging stations now. Meanwhile, we can electrify the entire system, and the only way that we're going to do that is through public ownership, ultimately saying that the infrastructure in the United States is vital to national security, and in doing so, we need to electrify it, and the big Class 1 railroad shouldn't have any say on that. The narrative truly needs to be brought away from asking, and the narrative that people should be talking about is, why aren't we doing this first before electric cars? Because even if you electrify every car in America, you're still going to have to redesign your cities, because if you don't, our cities are going to go bankrupt, and you're still going to have horrible climate change and horrible cities to live in that are overcrowded with cars. I believe that's where rail ties in, is it needs to take the forefront in electrification before we focus on electric cars.
Okay. Any final thoughts?
I toss in one I know I've spoken of, but this point, the proliferation of EVs and autonomous vehicles are repeating the worst aspects of the autocentric culture, because it's founded on individualism. See the USA in your Chevrolet. It's no different than saying, see the USA in your EV. See the USA in your autonomous vehicle. We're replicating the very same problems we had with autocentric culture. It's time to look at it for what it is. It's served its purpose, it's run its course, and it's now turned backwards on us. And if the fossil fuel groups win this battle that we're engaged in at our level here in Baltimore's regional and state, every drink of water you take is going to be dirtier than the one before. Every breath you take is going to be more toxic than the one you took before. The species is at risk, friends, nothing less.
Absolutely. We want to take a break real quick and ask folks to take some action with us. Now, if you've been on the first webinar, you've seen this action before. But if you'd like to lend your hand in voicing your support for the Public Rail Now Coalition that RWU set up with, and our campaign for rail in the public interest, we're going to drop a link in the chat that you can go and sign on and support. Please click the link in the chat to support if you'd like to sign for this. We also have a link if you're not the designated signer for your organization. We can definitely follow back up with you later. But yeah, we want to drop that in the link now. If you'd like to take some time, we're going to get into some of these questions. The first question comes from Brian, and this is to all of you. How can we get the companies such as Norfolk Southern, Amtrak, CSX to endorse passenger rail in America's communities? I think that if they were cash strapped and the government continues to bail out, communities can lobby for requests. Any thoughts on that?
Well, at the risk of sounding redundant, I don't think it's possible to get them on board in many, many, many cases. There are a few shining examples, but they don't disprove the rule. The Capital Corridor in California between San Jose, the Bay Area, and Sacramento was developed in the last 25 years. There was hardly any trains between those cities, and now there's about 20 trains a day, I believe. It's well used. And how was it done? It's a fairly little sleepy single track railroad, Union Pacific, and the state poured in a huge amount of money to double track that railroad, CTC, 79 mile an hour, with crossovers every 10 miles or so. And that was able to create an actual pretty busy passenger train corridor. But the state paid a huge price for that. There's certain cases where the Class 1 railroads are amenable. For example, if there is a lightly used freight line, a secondary main, maybe 6 or 8 trains a day, in some cases, a Class 1 railroad is like, sure, we'll let you run a passenger train because it's actually a minor amount of revenue on a lightly used line. But most of the main lines are still single track, are extremely clogged up because they are running these super duper long, heavy, cumbersome trains, and passenger trains just get in the way and reduce their ability to make profit for their stockholders. So in general, I just don't think we can coax, cajole, or get the Class 1s to cooperate as a general rule.
Fred,
They're
did you
not
have
going to. Yeah, I agree with Ron. They're not going to, and you're not going to coax them into it. They're going to have to be compelled.
I agree with the statement about compulsion. In the legal background for all of these companies, which are all or almost all 19th century companies, there are legal requirements that they are grossly violating. The Plum Plan, written up by the attorney Plum a century ago, cites these older laws, which the companies then were violating. There's a lost armament of legal tools that we can use, we and our lawyers can use to bully these companies a bit and take away the initiative that they now have in the public dialogue. These guys are breaking the law every day in the most fundamental sense of the law because they're not carrying out their public duty. The Plum Plan has it. I won't paraphrase it any longer. It's much better written than what we can summon up here. This battle was fought already. It was almost won. The Plum Plan was taken seriously. The unions all backed it. We can do this. We almost did it. We can do it now with the increasing environmental pressure that the companies are putting upon us by colossal accidents like the most recent one.
Thank you. And the last question, aside from nationalization, and this is from Emmett, of freight rail lines, what other pathways could be pursued to resolve conflicts between freight companies and Amtrak so that Amtrak could run on time, increase frequency, and reinstate routes like the Gulf Coast that we talked about? Is it through legislation? Is it through federal rulemaking? Is it federal enforcement? What is it?
One thing that absolutely would need to be done is you'd have to put limitations on the length of these trains. They would have to set a standard and say, okay, well, your average siding is 8,000 feet long. Well, in order to allow fluid movement of passenger trains, you can't run trains longer than your sidings. Either that or you need to put money into investing into double track. Until you do that, until there is a hard, fast rule that they cannot run trains longer than the sidings, they're going to continue to do that. And they can say that they're not delaying Amtrak, but if you have a 10,000 or 12,000 foot train running along a line that only has 8,000 foot sidings, where is the 80-mile-an-hour Amtrak going to get around the 40-mile-an-hour freight? And they don't care.
And I would just add to that, if the railroads want to pursue their goal of single person crew operations of freight trains, we all know who have worked in freight service that especially long trains, but even if the trains were shortened, trains have problems. They're mechanical. They operate in blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, extreme heat. They break down. And when they do, if you have a single person train operation, that is going to dramatically hinder the expediting of passenger trains. And so the point here, what Paul was saying, the idea for the single person crew and so forth, it's not going to work. So we have to sort of, in effect, outlaw precision scheduled railroading. We have to return to a model that, like Tom White would talk about as a former dispatcher who's involved with the Climate Rail Alliance. We have to go back 50 years or more when railroads were actually scheduled and they ran short, fast trains, and passenger trains can zip in and out of the freight trains. What we have now is the antithesis of that. I live here at the foot of the Sierra Nevada. Somebody, it might have been you, Paul, sent me something a few months ago. There were 85 train movements over the Sierra Nevada, scheduled movements every day. We don't have 15, 20 freight trains plus Amtrak 5 and 6 go over that mountain. And 5 and 6 are chronically late because they cannot get over the hill when you have a 15,000-foot train without enough power. The locomotives are not properly maintained. One of them takes a dive, and now you don't have a proper horsepower to the tonnage ratio. And the train literally, I'm not lying, is going up the Sierra Nevada at 7 or 8 miles an hour with Amtrak train number 6, the California Zephyr, right on its markers. And this, if we want to believe that we can coexist with the Class 1 private freight industry, huge changes would have to be made in their operations. The basic model that they use to run trains would have to be completely turned on its head, and they're not going to do it. And I'm not convinced that we can force them to. 150 years of attempting to regulate the railroad hasn't worked very well.
I'll go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something too, that obviously you're not going to convince the public to nationalize outright the rail industry because you do have these private companies, but the goal here is to make it to where ultimately the physical plant, the physical infrastructure itself is ultimately at the control and the decision making of the public on this. And I guarantee you that if the rail themselves were maintained and kept for the public interest, and these Class 1 railroads were allowed to operate and compete on them, then they would naturally, through compulsion by market forces and having to compete, they would run shorter trains because they could no longer just abuse and take advantage of customers anymore, because all of a sudden these public rails are open to whoever wants to run trains on them, whether it be government agencies or other railroads, or say large companies that just want to run their own trains, hauling their own goods. There's nothing stopping it at that point. And now if these Class 1s like Union Pacific want to exist anymore, now they would have to shorten their trains and run speedy expedited service like they used to, like Ron was talking about, because all of their traffic would flee and go elsewhere if they didn't.
And I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you to all of our panelists for being so knowledgeable and just giving us all of this free game for us. And thank you all for joining us. This is our last one of the year. We're going to take a break for the holiday season, but we're definitely going to continue the public transformation series once 2024 hits. But in the meantime, we enjoyed and we ask you to join us for Transit Equity Day, which is in February of 2024. We're definitely going to have a lot of conversation about rail in the public interest and topics like this. Also, if you've seen the link, please participate in our public rail efforts. Sign on to the endorsement letter, which is in the chat. As usual, follow all of us, all our social medias, as far as LNS on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as www.ln4s.org. Huge thank you to everyone again, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Bakari. Thanks,
Thank you so
everybody.
much, friends. And Bakari, thank you so very much.